Okay, we have our alternator mount loosely installed on the engine. You'll notice that we have the 3 long bushings between the head and the alternator mount. These 2 lower bolts, this one and this one, are a little bit longer than the 2 upper bolts, and that's because there's going to be another bracket that goes underneath these on the 2 lower bolts. We also have our alternator ready to go. We'll install that and show you how it looks when it's done. Install the bushing in the alternator, which sometimes you might have to get a punch and slightly tap around this bushing to drive it down. It does float, and then install your bushing. For a bushing in place, we're going to make sure that we install the rear bushing. You'll notice there's a step in this rear bushing, and that's to clearance this little tab that sticks out to keep the nut from turning. So make sure that when you install that that rear bushing, that you have the taper or the step towards the alternator. To go on to the accessory drive, we need to drill out the threads on this rear nut. Notice that we have the alternator in a vise with some aluminum pads. Drill a 10mm clearance hole. If you have a drill press, it works better, but you're fine with just using a drill. Okay, we have the alternator mocked up. You notice that nothing is tight. Don't tighten any one bolt until everything is in place. We still need to, of course, install this one final bolt. Make sure that your idler pulley turns freely. Coming around here, you have your spreader bushing for the alternator and the rear bushing with the machine step towards the alternator. Then you have your 4 alternator mount bolts in place. Remember that these 2 lower ones are slightly longer, and you'll see why in a minute.
We have prettier bolts now.
Alright, here's our power steering setup. Power steering rear bracket. Make sure that the flat edge goes towards the thermostat, or I'm sorry, the water pump outlet. You get your 2 long bushings, which go through this bracket, and this can get kind of confusing. So take a look at how this is on here. These 2 holes here are going to be where it pivots, where the power steering pump is going to pivot, and then these are going to be your adjustment. On this idler, make sure you do not confuse the bushings. You'll see that there's a bushing on the inside and then a separate stepped bushing which accepts this idler on the outside. There's also a dust washer on here. Make sure that stays in place. After you torque that nut down or that bolt down, make sure that this still turns freely. And again, don't tighten anything until everything is in place. Snug it all up, get the power steering pump in, then tighten them all down. Alright, one of the nice things about our swap is you don't have to disconnect any of the hoses on your AC line. You will have disconnected your reservoir, and you're going to turn your pump over. Back of the pump, you're going to see 3 holes that line up with the front holes, and these front holes have been drilled and tapped already for 8x125. So we're going to tap these rear holes. You'll notice that they're already drilled out. All you have to do is tap them, and it's pretty easy. It's aluminum. So tap all 3 of these, and then we'll show you how to mount it onto the power steering pump brackets. Alright, we got our power steering pump in its bracket. You'll notice that we have 3 8x125 bolts, 25mm long, which is essentially 1 inch. This center bolt is the pivot bolt, and these 2 outer bolts are the adjustment bolts. This is a mechanical tensioner versus an automatic tensioner, and it has some advantages, especially on the trail. The third bolt is the pivot bolt in the front. That again is an 8x125, 25mm long. You can get it with a socket through this hole in the pulley, or you can get your wrench in the side like so. And the nice thing about this is you can actually replace your belt on the trail with 1 wrench. Now, after you have your pump mounted, make sure that you have full movement here. in these slots. This belt will actually tension with about 1/4 to 1/2 of the slot available, and because of the mechanical advantage we've designed into it, it's very easy to over tighten the belt, so you don't want to do that. After you get your belt on, you're going to tension it so that there's about 1/2 inch of play on the leg between the air compressor and the alternator, and we'll talk about that later. And then about 500 miles later, you're going to want to tension it again. Also, take a look at your pulleys and make sure they're all lined up in the same plane. Make sure that your alternator pulley, idler pulley, your alternator, serpentine pulley, water pump, and power steering pump are all lined up. We have had customers swap bushings around and get the wrong combination. We're going to talk about the AC bracket now. There's actually two of them. This front one on the main, we call it the main bracket, and this rear one, which is the rear bracket. Go ahead and mount it to your block with the 3 bolts, 10mm bolts provided. 1, 2, 3. Now I want to say something. If you have a cast iron block, this boss on the block is here, but it's not drill and tapped. Drill and tap it for a 10mm bolt. This bolt hole will not be there on a cast iron block. Just leave it blank. So go ahead and mount those two. And on the rear, you have this 10mm bolt and an 8mm bolt down there that you hopefully can see. We have the compressor temporarily in here with 1 bolt, and I want to show you how this can be adjusted with the harmonic balancer. You'll notice that there's some movement. We've actually slotted these holes so this compressor can be tilted and brought in and out. It must be perfectly lined up with the harmonic balancer, otherwise you're going to have problems. In the rear, I hope you can see this, but that rear lug now will go onto that rear bracket, and then there's going to be another front bracket that's going to drop down and box this all in. But the most critical thing right now is to get this compressor lined up with a harmonic balancer. Take a straight edge and you're going to run it along the face of the balancer, and you're going to look at your compressor and get all your bolts in. Don't tighten any of them up, but you're going to snug the bolts up and move it slightly until you get the front of the compressor completely parallel with the balancer. Then, looking from the side, you're going to change the position of your straight edge, and you're going to view this from the side and make sure that it's perfectly lined up, perpendicular to the harmonic balancer. It's best if you do this before you install the motor. It makes the job a little bit easier, but make sure it's correct before you start the engine, otherwise you may have problems with your belt.